A short while ago, I was joined by the Leader of the Opposition. Tony Abbott, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Is offshore processing in the national interest?
The right sort of offshore processing is in the national interest, and the right sort of offshore processing is offshore processing with appropriate protections, and that's what the Howard government provided at Nauru.
What are appropriate protections?
Well, at Nauru, under the Howard government, and that was a regime which did actually stop the boats, the right protections were processing by Australians under Australian conditions and people being in centres that were run by Australians in accordance with Australian standards.
How can you maintain that and have a policy to turn back boats on the high seas?
Well, again, we've been entirely consistent for a decade. Our policy to stop the boats, then as now, has involved three key elements: Nauru, temporary protection visas, and turning boats around where it is safe to do so.
And when is it ever safe?
Well, that's a judgment that the operational commanders would make under the circumstances of the time. But they did make it on a number of occasions under the Howard government, and there's no reason, with the right level of cooperation with Indonesia, that we couldn't do it again.
And they adapted, they burned and sank their boats. What if they do that again?
Well, as I said, we would have to be guided by the operational judgment of the naval commanders on the spot. But there is no reason why a sensible Australian government would deny itself the option of turning boats around where it is safe to do so.
Your policy on this, on towback, says that it requires a commitment from the return country not to return asylum seekers to a place from which they claim to be fleeing persecution. Mm-hmm. Do you have that kind of commitment from Indonesia?
Well, that's the commitment that we expected under the Howard government, and there is no evidence that the Indonesian government did refool people in the past. We have no reason to think they wouldn't be prepared to enter into the same kind of understandings again.
And yet the head of the Indonesian People Smuggling Task Force said recently that towbacks were inhumane and dangerous.
We managed to get a good arrangement with Indonesia in the past, and there's no reason, particularly under President Yudhoyono, why we couldn't have a good arrangement in the future.
Would you get an assurance for all of them, or would you get something that was legally binding?
Well, again, we would be absolutely consistent with the policy that we've had for the last 10 years. And if it worked in the past, there's no reason why it can't work again in the future.
Because, of course, you said that the Malaysian solution, one of the problems with it is that there are no legally binding assurances, yet you would have none for a towback policy, would you?
But the policy worked in the past to stop the boats, and there's no reason why it won't work again in the future.
Could you do something like that in good conscience?
Well, let me just point out to you, Chris, that no less an authority than Father Frank Brennan, the Jesuit theologian and activist, has said that the coalition's policy is more moral than that of the Labor Party.
I'm sure he wasn't referring to boat towbacks.
Well, that's what he said. That our policy was more moral than that of the Labor Party.
As a matter of principle, should the executive be allowed to make immigration law?
Well, the executive government will put its proposals to the Parliament, and the Parliament will deal with them. But there has never been any principle that says that the opposition has got to support bad policy from a bad government to give a blank cheque to the executive.
And if your amendments fail, will you support the government's?
No, we won't. Our amendments are quite minor in the scheme of the Government's Act. We are only proposing one amendment to a 20-page bill, but nevertheless it is a very significant principle. It, as the former Solicitor General David Bennett made clear, our amendment means that the Government's bill will be more certain and more safe. There'll be more legal certainty and more protections in it if our amendment is passed, and that's why we're going to insist upon it.
And doesn't this standoff mean that inevitably Australia will return to only onshore processing?
No, because if the government is committed to offshore processing at Manus as well as at Malaysia, our amendment will certainly allow it to happen at Manus.
So as far as you're concerned, the conversation is finished with the government on its amendment?
Well, The government believes that negotiations involve simply accepting everything they propose, but what we've done is we've accepted all their briefings, we've listened respectfully to the advice that the officials have given us. I've given the Prime Minister a fair hearing. I candidly told the Prime Minister what our intentions were in respect of the legislation that they gave us on Friday. She then gave us new legislation, different legislation, rather than simply respond on the spot. I did the responsible thing. I got advice from David Bennett QC, the former Solicitor General, and his advice is that our proposition is more certain and more protective, better protections and more certainty.
On another matter, industrial relations, do you think that there should be a return to individual contracts?
No, I don't. I think that there should be a community debate. I'm happy that there is a community debate. I think the debate should focus on practical problems with the government's legislation, not on the philosophy of workplace relations. And I have certainly encouraged people to come forward to us and to others with practical difficulties that the government's legislation is causing.
And if the answer they have is individual contracts would make the workplace more flexible, you wouldn't listen to them?
Well, we don't support statutory individual contracts. We did once, we don't now. We're happy to look at building more flexibility into the Fair Work Act. As Heather Ridout said the other day, the individual flexibility agreements under the Fair Work Act have promised so much, delivered so little, and I'll be looking forward to the kind of suggestions that people like Heather might have once they've spoken to their members.
Do you have any of your own?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any of your own, other than individual contracts? How would you make the workplace more flexible?
Well, we'll have a policy in good time before the next election, Chris, but I'm not going to preempt the kind of feedback that we've got to get from the community.
BHP made a $22 billion profit. That's the largest corporate profit in Australia's history, and yet you think that the Australian taxpayer doesn't deserve more of that share of our mining boom.
Well, they pay the standard corporate tax rate on that. We've never, as a nation, believed in progressive company tax. They also pay mining royalties for the non-renewable resources that they use, and if the community judges that the mining companies ought to be giving more back, why don't the states increase the mining royalties? That would be a perfectly legitimate thing for the states to do.
But what's your judgment on that? Do you think that a $22 billion profit, an 86% increase on the year before, a one-off?
What's wrong with profit?
Well, there's nothing wrong with profit.
Nothing
it's
wrong
just
with
whether
profit,
or not
Chris.
the community, because
the
minerals in the ground belong to the Australian community, don't they?
And royalties are what the mining companies have historically paid to the community via the state governments for using those non-renewable resources. And if people feel they ought to pay more, well, then it's perfectly up to the states to increase the royalties. But on the general principle, I am pleased BHP is doing well. Very pleased that BHP is doing well. It shows that a fine Australian company is succeeding in the cutthroat business of mining, and I want to encourage further success. I don't want to handicap it.
Do you think the government should intervene to protect manufacturing?
I think that the government should establish, as far as we humanly can, a genuinely level playing field. That doesn't mean tariffs, it doesn't mean subsidies, it doesn't mean building walls against the world, it does mean no carbon tax. It does mean no carbon tax, because that is going to penalise manufacturing big time.
But the dollar's a bigger problem at the moment, isn't it?
The dollar is a problem, and as I keep saying, Chris, if we got the fundamentals right, by getting government spending under control, that would take pressure off interest rates, and that would take pressure off the exchange rate.
Are you really going to tear up the Defence White Paper and halve the number of joint strike fighters that the Australian government would buy?
No one has said that we would tear up the Defence White Paper, but from time to time, these matters do need to be reconsidered. The point that I made today is that no area of government expenditure is exempt from the search for savings, but the Coalition will never make savings at the expense of the operational capabilities of our Defence Force.
And do you think that the ABC should be running the satire At Home with Julia?
Well, you're in the ABC, Chris.
Unfortunately, these decisions are beyond my pay grade. What do you think about the satire? And about the Prime Minister being shown naked under an Australian flag?
Look, if people don't like it, they can turn off. And loath as I am to suggest that anyone should turn off the national broadcaster, that's their option if they don't like it. I am very reluctant to accuse the ABC of being sexist or of breaching community standards, as you'd expect.
Do you think it's tasteless?
Look, I haven't seen the program. I haven't read those news reports. I think in the end, this is a matter for the ABC to judge. I don't normally believe in political censorship. I don't normally think that people at the ABC would believe in political censorship. If people at the ABC have gone too far, well then there are internal ABC processes which no doubt can be gone through, and if the public don't like it, don't watch it.
There surely are. Tony Abbott, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.